Good Shabbos, everyone. As the atrocities of October 7th fade from memories, world empathy, of course, is switching increasingly from slaughtered Israelis to bombarded Gazans. We knew it would happen. We predicted it. It actually took longer than I thought it would, but we are here. And of course, very few blame Hamas for what continues to be happening in Gaza, or for the last 15 years or so. And few blame the Arab countries like Egypt, who won't even take in those with U.S. passports from Gaza. According to a lot of the world, it's all Israel's fault. So calls for a ceasefire are growing louder and louder. But it's not just media outlets or those who didn't like Israel before October 7th. I've even had congregants, family members, lovers of Israel, saying, Rabbi, maybe Israel should stop. Maybe a ceasefire is a way to go. It comes from a good place. They're worried that it will get even worse when Israel goes in with the ground offensive. More innocent Gazans will die. Israel will be blamed, hated even more. And of course, I know we're all concerned, very concerned, about the countless brave Israeli soldiers who may lose their lives in Gaza. None of us like war. None of us want innocent civilians to die. That's not who we are. That's not who Jews are. That's not what our tradition represents. So we may wonder, maybe a ceasefire is the way to go right now. I'm here to tell you tonight, at this point, Israel cannot agree to a ceasefire. And let me explain why. Like many of us, as a young child growing up comfortable in America, I learned about the horrors that were confined to Jewish history. The expulsions, the forced conversions, the massacres, gas chambers, Kishinev, Farhud, the history of pogroms, those violent acts against defenseless Jews in Russia, in the Pale of Settlement, and in parts of the Arab world. They happened in 1881, 1903, 1919, 1938, 1941, 1947, and then it stopped. There have, of course, been multiple terrorist attacks since then, but no more pogroms because of 1948. When Jews, for the first time in 2,000 years, found refuge in a place to defend themselves. Pogroms were supposed to be confined to history. And that, of course, was until October 7th, when we, of course, returned to the worst moments in our history. Many years ago, in 1995, I had the honor of traveling to Poland. I went on March of the Living. And as part of March of the Living, we went to Treblinka, the worst of the death camps, where almost 1 million Jews were murdered in just 11 months. Some of my own relatives, my great-grandparents and great-uncle were murdered there. And I'll never forget being at Treblinka. And I almost felt my ancestors speaking to me, telling me 3 things that I've mentioned before, thanking me for being there to pay respects to them, reminding me to make sure the world never forgets what happened during the Holocaust, and asking me to do what I can to make sure it never happens again. Unfortunately, October 7th, it did happen again. And October 7th is what Jewish history is all too often looked like. Civilians, Jews, publicly targeted, tortured, and murdered, with crimes put on public display, and this time with cell phones and social media for the world to see. But this time, of course, not in the Pale of Settlement or in Arab cities throughout the Middle East, in Israel. What's the word for pogrom in Israel? It doesn't exist. There is no Hebrew word for pogrom because it never happened before in Israel, and no one ever thought it would, but now it did. Author Dana Horn writes, "There's a reason so many Jews cannot stop shaking right now. The concept of intergenerational trauma doesn't begin to describe the dark place into which this month's attack plunged Jewish communities around the world. I too have been in mourning. I know we all are in our own ways. It's like we're going through Shloshim, the 30 days when we lose a loved one. It's been 3 weeks so far, but it feels like 3 hours. And I know we'll continue to mourn. And I know eventually, like all those who we mourn for, we continue to move on through our mourning, and we eventually get back to a place of happiness. But at least I know for many of us, and I can certainly tell you for me, I'm still having a very difficult time. This Shabbat, in Parsha Lech Lecha, that we read tomorrow, we Jews read about covenants. The first covenant God makes with our people, a covenant between God and Abraham, the Brit, the eternal Brit, between God and the Jewish people. That we will be a people chosen not because we are better than others, but chosen to follow God's commandments, to be a godly nation. Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, also created a covenant, a 1948 covenant, where the state of Israel, its government and security services said, we will forever protect Israelis from further atrocities like pogroms. It was basically a promise to forever prevent the reoccurrence of tragedies. Nowhere in the world would Jews be safer than Israel. That pledge, that Brit, was broken October 7th. And why does that matter? Former Israeli ambassador Michael Oren articulated it perfectly. He writes, based on that covenant, that pledge that the modern state of Israel made with Jews everywhere, generations of Israelis sent their children to the army and spent months each year in the reserves. We put up with some of the world's highest taxes, he writes, and cost of living, and a political system that was seldom stable. But we did it because we believed the state would always be there in our hour of need. That was our social contract. And despite wars, terror attacks, and domestic upheavals, it hung together until 3 weeks ago. In other words, our brothers and sisters in Israel put up with a lot because they believed in the promise that Jews would never be defenseless again. For Israel to survive, for Israelis to continue to stay, that covenant must be repaired, or Israel may be done, God forbid. And there's only one way to repair that covenant, that modern day promise, the complete and utter destruction of Hamas. Why is that the case? First, there are practical ramifications within the greater Middle East. On October 7th, Israel's enemies like Iran saw that Israel's borders are porous. The people can get in. And that the Israel Defense Forces, as powerful as they are, for all their power, lacked the ability for too many hours on that Black Sabbath to defend the country, to defend civilians. They were as surprised as we were, maybe more so. Complete victory over Hamas is necessary to reestablish Israeli deterrence. As you've often heard before, in the most difficult area of the world, only the strong survive. And it's not just because of Israel's enemies. It was Israel's strength, her economic and military strength, that brought about the Abraham Accords with her new Middle East friends, countries like Bahrain and Dubai and Morocco. If Israel does not bring back her deterrence, Saudi Arabia will never enter the Abraham Accords. Instead, Saudi Arabia may look to make more accommodations with Iran. It's anyone's guess if even if the Abraham Accords themselves will survive, the UAE and Bahrain may be forced to rethink whether a strategic alliance with Israel or Iran is more in their national security interests. And if these reasons weren't serious enough, there's another reason why Hamas must be destroyed, one that is even more important, one that I alluded to earlier. If the conflict ends in a ceasefire now or too early before Hamas is destroyed, who would move back to the south of Israel? Would you live there with your family if Hamas was still in charge in Gaza? But it's not just the south of Israel. God forbid Israelis throughout the country may decide to raise their children elsewhere in places that may seem safer for Jews. Who would have ever thought? Complete victory, which can be done, is necessary to preserve the reason for Israel's existence. If Hamas survives to fight another day, no matter how many of the terrorists die, they and Iran will have won the war. And the cycle will begin again someday soon. Except this time, Hamas and Iran will be stronger, and Israel will be weaker. Israel must have total victory. To say to the world, to say to you and me, to say to Jews everywhere, to say to Israelis most importantly, that covenant, that Brit of the modern state of Israel is secure. It survives. In the day of pogroms, the times of defenseless Jews are done for good. The stakes for Israel could not be higher. Our ancient rabbis, thousands of years ago, who lived in the land of Israel long before Hamas, but knew of other bitter enemies and cruel enemies, often taught wise words. They said, one who is kind to the cruel will end up being cruel to the kind. One who is kind to the cruel will end up being cruel to the kind. The rabbis reminded us long ago that allowing cruel people like Hamas to survive so they can continue to pursue their evil designs will ultimately lead to the death of more and more innocents. In this case, if Israel agrees to a ceasefire before the job is finished, more Jews will die, more innocent Palestinians will die, and there will be more days like October 7th, and more wars like we're going through now. The only way to prevent further attacks of this kind is to render Hamas physically incapable of executing them forever. There is no credible, effective alternative. And yes, I know an Israeli ground offensive is a grim prospect, which will cost even more lives, most importantly of Israeli soldiers, young Israelis, 19, 20 years old. It's been bad so far, and it will probably get even worse. And more of the world will demand a ceasefire. Many of those calls will come from our enemies. You've seen them already. On progressive college campuses, in Arab capitals, in left-wing European capitals, even parts of our Congress. More of those calls will come from our enemies. A ceasefire too early is a victory for Hamas. Some of the calls for a ceasefire will come from those who just don't care. They just don't want to see the pictures of war on their screens anymore. And some of those calls for a ceasefire may even come from us, people that love Israel, because I know it's hard. These are difficult days. I too would rather not be speaking about war every week, but about the Parsha or something much less serious, like why I'm glad Dusty Baker is retiring. But we are not at that time yet. Truly, I never thought I would say these words, but Israel is in a fight for its existence. That covenant has to be reestablished. So it's time to dig deep within ourselves. We have not gone through this in many generations. We have to dig deep within our spiritual resources, within our Jewish souls, within our collective memories, as a community and as individuals, as Jews and as Zionists. Can we persevere? John Adams, the second president of the United States, once said long ago, he said, "I must study politics and war so my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." Israel must prosecute this war to its end so that the next generation, God willing, might have a chance to grow up without this sort of war. Shabbat shalom, everyone. And as we'll continue to do, let us rise now for Hatikvah.